In the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, one of the major card types is traps, which often have powerful effects, but have the downside of needing to be set first, with some notable exceptions. Trap cards are divided into 3 separate categories: normal, continuous, and counter, with the first 2 types having spell speed 2 priority, and the latter being what constitutes spell speed 3. While normal and continuous traps can be chained by cards like monster quick effects or quick play spells, counter traps can only be chained by other counter traps, making them the last part of the chain. This list will focus on some of the best and worst counter traps from the very beginning of the game before the advent of synchro monsters. And starting off with the 5th best counter trap, we have Negate Attack, which was first released as a promotional card in 2003's Yu-Gi-Oh! The Sacred Cards for the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. It would later get its first mass market release in 2006 Duelist Pack Jade and Yugi. Negate Attack can only be activated when your opponent's monster declares an attack. Once activated, the monster's attack is negated, and the battle phase immediately comes to an end. Negate Attack is actually really good at saving you in a pinch, giving you an extra turn to make a comeback. While it may be overshadowed by more powerful battle traps and Mirror Force, Negate Attack was unlimited, which Mirror Force was either limited or straight up banned throughout the classic era. Additionally, because Negate Attack is a counter trap, its effects can't be responded to as easily as Mirror Force. For example, a monster might dodge Mirror Force's destruction effect by being flipped face down by utilizing the commonly played Book of Moon. Another benefit of utilizing Negate Attack over Mirror Force is that because the battle phase is ended by the card, your opponent can't utilize a card like Call of the Haunted to get an additional attack off. While Negate Attack is also good for stalling out turns, especially in decks that utilize Final Countdown, other cards like Waboku and Threatening Roar prove to be more valuable, as they can be played before the battle phase, with their lingering effects protecting you from attacks for the rest of the turn, thus being able to dodge spell and trap card removal. Still, Negate Attack proved useful enough to earn a spot on this best of list. Our next card, however, will kick off the worst counter trap list with a very niche effect. And in the number 5 spot of the worst counter traps list is Armor Break. It was first released in 2004's Ancient Sanctuary. Since then, Armor Break was only reprinted one more time in 2005's Dark Revelation Volume 2. Armor Break's effect is to negate the activation of an equipped spell card and destroy it. Usually, counter traps and negate cards have some downside or cost, but that's not the case for Armor Break. It's so niche that Konami must have felt fine just letting it be a straight up negate. But that's also its downside. Not a lot of decks used a plethora of equipped spells in this era. In fact, there were maybe 2 targets this could often negate: Snatch Steal and Premature Burial, which was common enough in most deck lists. There is one problem, however. Since equipped spells have to stay face up on the field to have their effects activated, you could just destroy the card instead. Just like how Snatch Steal and Premature Burial were universally played, so are the 3 most common back row destructions: Mystical Space Typhoon, Heavy Storm, and Breaker the Magical Warrior. If that wasn't enough, Dust Tornado and Raigeki Break, both of which could destroy an equipped spell, were commonly played as well. Why even use Armor Break at all then? It could be a funny option playing against a friend with a Mahavalio deck, but that's about it. Sometimes being too specific can't make up for not having a cost, but that will be a running theme in this worst of counter traps on our list. And at number 4 for our best counter trap is Magic Drain, which was first released in 2003's Pharaoh Servant, with its most recent reprint coming in 2023's 25th anniversary version of the same pack. Magic Drain can be activated in response to your opponent activating a spell card. When you do so, your opponent is given the option to discard a spell card or have the activation of their spell card be negated. While most counter traps have a cost for the user, Magic Drain offloads the cost on your opponent, which makes it a great backup negate card. If the spell card your opponent is playing is extremely important and or is limited at the time, your opponent is more incentivized to discard a spell, if they have one. This turns Pot of Greed from a +1 in card advantage to just breaking even, and Graceful Charity from breaking even into a -1. If your opponent doesn't have a spell card to discard, the spell will just be negated, making Magic Drain combo well with cards that hand rep like Don Zalug and Trap Dust Shoot. The only reason Magic Drain isn't higher on this list is because it isn't a force to negate, and sometimes that guaranteed negate is better than the card advantage you can gain. The next card on our list also negates spells, but in a far worse way. And at number 4 on our worst of counter trap list is Spell Stopping Statue. It was first released in 2005 as a Lost Millennium and was reprinted in 2006 Dark Revelation Volume 3. Spell Stopping Statue can be activated when your opponent activates a continuous spell card. When you do so, the activation of the continuous spell card is negated and the card is destroyed. Similar to Armor Break previously on this list, Spell Stopping Statue doesn't have an additional cost, and the cards it negates can be destroyed instead of negating them, since they have to remain face up on the field for their effects to work. Unlike Armor Break though, Spell Stopping Statue doesn't have a universally played target that it can negate. In fact, you'd be hard pressed to find good targets during this area of the game for Statue to negate, with the best ones being floodgates like Level Limit Area B and Dimensional Fissure. While there are a few other good continuous spells, they appear far less frequently than one would assume. It really feels like Konami made Spell Stopping Statue because they could, and not because it was actually needed. And yet this is only the 4th worst on our list. We've got some real stinkers coming up. But for now, back to the best counter trap list. And at number 3 on our best of list, we have Dark Bribe, a counter trap that was first released as a promotional card for the 2007 video game Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Tag Force 2 on the PlayStation Portable. It wouldn't get a mass market release until late 2008 in Dark Legends. Dark Bribe can be activated in response to your opponent's spell or trap. Your opponent draws one card, and their spell or trap card's activation is negated and destroyed. While letting your opponent go +1 in card advantage to ensure a negate may seem a little ludicrous now, we have to remember the context of the game when Dark Bribe released. There were barely any hand traps in the game at this point, and the games were usually slower. This meant that giving your opponent a draw, while not ideal, might be worth it depending on the card you negated. Dark Bribe could be vital in helping you win the game by stopping a pesky battle trap like Mirror Force, or can stop your opponent from going for game by wiping out your back row with cards like Heavy Storm. This card is really good, despite the -1 in card advantage, but it had one other major issue with it at the time. By being a video game promotional card, it wasn't the easiest to get a playset of at the time. While it was reprinted a year later, this was after the release of the first synchro monsters, the hard cutoff line for our list. Had Dark Bribe been a little bit more accessible, it might have netted a slightly higher spot in our list. Alas, it's time to return to our worst of lists. And at number 3 for the worst of lists, we have Counter Counter, a counter trap card first released in 2007's Tactical Evolution and was reprinted once in 2008's Champion Pack Game 7. Getting one reprint seems to be a recurring theme with these bad ones. Counter Counter can be activated to negate the activation of a counter trap card and destroy it. This feels more like a gag than a real card, yet here we are. The type of counter traps that make great negate cards are typically wide-reaching in their negation abilities while not having too steep of an activation cost. They can often negate all traps by default, and yet Counter Counter is here to only negate other counter trap cards. This card might make for a great joke amongst friends. I'll counter your counter trap with my Counter Counter, but could never be used seriously in any level, let alone classic Yu-Gi-Oh! While the card is pretty unplayable on its own merits, what if I told you there were versions of this card that were actually unplayable? In its original printing, some versions of the card were misprinted, not having the counter trap symbol on it. That means the misprinted versions were normal traps, making them spell speed 2, and were unable to be activated in response to the cards they were meant to negate, since they were all spell speed 3. The reprint of Counter Counter corrected this misprint, not that anyone noticed anyway. And at the number 2 spot of the best of list goes to Pulling the Rug, a counter trap first released in 2007 Strike of Neos. Its most recent reprint came in 2023's OTS Tournament Pack 23, which was a welcome sight to the Time Wizard players in the community. Pulling the Rug can be activated in response to the effect of a monster whose effect is activated when it's normal summoned. The activation of the effect is negated and the monster is destroyed. Basically, the easiest way to think of this card is that it's used when a monster has a when this card is normal summoned or tribute summoned effect. The effect is rather weak now, with the game revolving around mostly special summon monsters, but in the past, however, many of the best monster effects activated when a monster was normal summoned, with the best examples of these being the Monarch cards. The Monarch effects activated when they were tribute summoned, and with many of them having very powerful effects, Pulling the Rug became a very useful card to stop them in their tracks. There are some caveats to what Pulling the Rug could be used on though. If an effect is optional, like Mobius the Frost Monarch's effect is, and the controller of the card chooses not to activate the effect, you can't use Pulling the Rug to destroy the monster. Additionally, ignition effects, which have a turn player priority in this time of the game's history, can be activated on summon, but don't trigger pulling the rug's activation cost. Obviously, these factors didn't stop pulling the rug from scene play, which really came to head slightly after synchro monsters were introduced to the game. However, this does allow the top card of the best of list to edge it out, but before we get to that, we have to return to the worst of list. And at number 2 on the worst of list, we have Featherwind, a counter trap that was first released in 2005's Elemental Energy, and was most recently reprinted in 2011's Legendary Collection 2, the Duel Academy Year's Mega Pack. Featherwind can only be activated in response to an opponent's spell or trap card activation, but only if you control a face-up elemental hero avian. If you meet that requirement, the spell or trap card's activation is negated and the card is destroyed. So, the major issue with this card is the requirement of controlling an Elemental Hero Avian to activate the card at all. Elemental Hero Avian is a level 3 Wind Warrior normal monster with a measly 1000 attack and defense, allowing it to be easily trampled over by most normal summon monsters at the time. Additionally, the only decks that would want to use the card at the time were the original Elemental Hero decks that focused on turboing out their boss monsters, Elemental Hero Flame Wingman and Elemental Hero Thunder Giant. However, some of the monsters could be replaced by using King of the Swamp, which also doubles as a polymerization searcher. Additionally, using the normal Elemental Hero monsters quickly went out of fashion with the rise of better Elemental Heroes. Obviously, Featherwind didn't see play as it wasn't worth leaving a weak monster that was best used for a fusion material on the field just for a spell or trap card negate. The sad part is, if the card wasn't tied specifically to Avian and worked with any Elemental Hero, it would have been very playable, like a classic version of Protection of the Elements. But now we move on to the top card of our best of list. And the number 1 spot of the best of list goes to Solemn Judgment, a counter trap first released in 2002's Metal Raiders, with its most recent reprint coming in 2024's 25th Anniversary Rarity Collection 2. Solemn Judgment can be activated in response to your opponent's summoning of a monster or activation of a spell or a trap. Once Judgment is activated, you pay half your life points and negate the summon or activation of that spell or trap. The running joke in the Yugioh community is that you flip this card up and the text just says no. It's a pretty accurate joke as well, considering Judgment tends to be the most used counter trap and the end of any chain. Solemn Judgment is probably the counter trap that pops up in most people's heads first when you mention counter traps in the first place. Judgment is realistically the best counter trap in the entire game's history, let alone the classic era. However, it took players a while to figure that out. Paying half your life points was a big enough deal in the early game's history that many players shied away from using Judgment. The mindset of using life points as a resource and the only life point that matters is your last one simply just hadn't been invented yet. So players saw their life points as being far more important than they actually were. As a result of this, Solemn Judgment managed to stay unlimited through all of the classic era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is a little insane considering how many other powerhouse cards were banned or limited during this time period. Solemn Judgment wouldn't be limited until September 2009's Forbidden List, a little more than a year after the release of the first synchro monsters. While the players in the past were ignorant of how good Judgment was, players who play older formats now, such as GOAT or Perfect Circle, have utilized Judgment heavily in their decks. The idea of taking lessons learned from future metas back to the past ones is why many people like Time Wizard formats, which have proven that even a card underrated during its era could be far better than once thought. Or, in the case of Solemn Judgment, you might just find the best counter trap of that era. But with every best, there must be a worse. Which brings us to the final card of this video. And at the top of our worst of list, we have Snake Deity's Command, a counter trap first released in 2007's Tactical Evolution. This is the part where I normally tell you about the card's reprints, but it has none. When you activate Snake Deity's Command, you must first reveal a Venom monster in your hand. Afterwards, you can negate the activation and effect of your opponent's spell card and destroy it. So, starting off, the cost of activating this card doesn't seem too bad. Instead of discarding an archetype card, you just have to reveal one, which is an easy enough task. While Command only negates spells, that's not too bad for a rare from an older set. The issue, though, is what archetype it belongs to. Venom might be one of the worst archetypes in all of Yu-Gi-Oh!, being bad back then and receiving very little support since the classic era. The Venom archetype's theme is placing Venom counters on monsters your opponent controls, and with any counter-based theme, the deck will only be as good as what you can utilize those counters to accomplish. In Venom's case, the counters don't actually do anything on their own, requiring Venom Swamp to be face-up on the field to have any effect. Venom Swamp can place a Venom counter on each face-up monster during the end phase, and makes all monsters lose 500 attack for each Venom counter on them, and destroys any monsters whose attack has been reduced to 0 by venom counters. But get this, if a monster's attack is originally 0, it can't be destroyed by Venom Swarm's effect, because it only works if it's reduced to 0. Many of the venom monsters have the ability to place venom counters on monsters, but they all have woefully low stats. Venom's boss monsters also are pretty bad, having obscure summoning methods and nothing to do with the actual venom counter mechanic. I think it should be clear now that this archetype is dreadful to use, even in a slower meta, which brings us back to Snake Deity's command. Yeah, all you have to do is just reveal a venom monster, but then you'd be playing a venom deck, and that's just awful. But more importantly, why doesn't it put venom counters on anything? This was the perfect card to slap a then place a venom counter on all monsters your opponent controls. But no, we get a worse magic jammer because going -1 is better than playing venoms.